COVID-19 was a very large shock. Fiscal policy came to the rescue. Public deficits and debts increased everywhere. That was crucial to avoid an even greater contraction in economic activity.
Let's talk France, and for more on this, let's go to Anne Elisabeth Moutet in Paris, and she's a columnist at the newspaper The Telegraph. And joining us from Zurich is Bruno Vers-trae-te. He's partner and chief economist at Lakefield Partners. Welcome to both of you. I want to go to you first, Bruno. How much more support can the French government give?
That's a very difficult question. I think as much as the financial markets believe is sustainable. Clearly, what has been done by the ECB is that they give the backing for very cheap credit. And they realize that a fiscal stimulus is the one to go for to leverage back into the economy and stimulate it rather than printing money. So they have the backup of cheap debt. And as long as financial markets sustain that cheap debt and the rates don't go up, it is sustainable. The question is, of course, once that breaks, it's very difficult to turn around. So it's a very difficult question to answer at this stage.
And Anne Elisabeth, you're there in Paris. Was the government's decision to avoid a new national lockdown, was that right for the economy? What are people saying?
It probably was right for the economy. I'm not sure it was right for the pandemic, but certainly that was the reason of the choice. Essentially, that as it is, many businesses are faltering. We know that 20% of French restaurants and cafes will not reopen after when the crisis is over, and it's far from over. And so it was seen as the decision that had to be taken with enough semi-measures like the curfew, which means that you're in lockdown effectively between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., and which means that you can't go to dinner, you can't meet people and create clusters, and they are trying to balance the economy and national health. It is not an easy position to take.
No, not at all. That really is such a struggle. Bruno, what are your clients, wealthy individuals and institutions telling you?
Well, clearly, I think the debt evolution in Europe is clearly their concern. That will eventually have to be paid back, and there's only very few ways that you can get rid of it. One of them being inflation. That's been on the desire list of the central banks for years now, and it's very difficult to do it. There's just too much supply and too little demand. And to also look into the individual countries' government debt, it becomes very, very tricky to protect your wealth going forward, knowing that a credit crisis, but then on the government debt level, is about to hit. We just don't know when, but it will be very, very difficult to hide in a place that doesn't have that issue, given the repercussions on the banks and on the pension funds, and it will really trickle down to a lot of dimensions.
And Anne Elisabeth, why do you think France's economy has done better than expected at the end of last year?
I think, first of all, because we were not starting from very high. And so if you look at the differential, or even if you look at the predictions for next year, it's easier to rebound. But also, we are one of Europe's largest economies. And therefore, to some extent, we are the state that it's too big to fail. So counting on very low interest rates, and also realizing that if you destroy the economy by imposing too stiff measures on the economy, the best you can do is to sort of help France rise from this difficult situation, because otherwise too many banks and too many institutions would be taken with it. I'm not saying it's going to last forever. I know that the former European Commissioner, Pierre Moscovici, who used to be France's finance minister and who now is the president of the National Court of Accounts, said that France would live with a debt above 100% of GDP for at least 10 more years. And that is very nice when you have negative interest rates. what happens if interest rates go back up? That is really, that's the $64 million question, and we don't know. The one thing that worries me in France is the fact that we are used to having debt, and when we were doing fine and there was no pandemic, every single politician, when they came to power, said, we will reduce debt, and they never did. We will reduce the portion of state expenditure in GDP, and they didn't. And it still is 53% of GDP, which is essentially state expenditure. It is not something that is sustainable in the long term.
And that leads me nicely to the question that, for Bruno, with the rising debt, is austerity looming there on the horizon for France?
Well, I think it's looming for everyone. The question is, can the economy bounce back? I think one specific element to France, or two of them, one is it's very service-oriented. There's 10% more dependency of the economy on services, so that needs to be rebound. And second of all, one shouldn't forget that not just the public debt is very elevated, but contrary to Italy and Spain and the other countries that are always mentioned in the debt discussion, France has a lot of private debt as well, linked to service companies. So I think that makes it a bigger issue. And for sure, austerity is going to happen, and the state will need to redefine their promises.
And Anne Elisabeth, how do you think the public in France would react to austerity?
I think the public is going to be spared austerity until the presidential election of May 2022, quite honestly, because I don't think anybody will run on an austerity program. And that means certainly President Macron, who may be re-elected, but that's now by no means certain, and everybody else running for this. So I think once again, France is going to defer taking hard decisions and making hard choices. The last time the IMF had an opinion about what we should do about our economy, that was 1983, 2 years after the election of François Mitterrand, who'd been spending, because it was the first time in 22 years that you had a hard left government in power. And the result was getting us the IMF. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in June of 2020.
And what do you think will happen? Yeah, and what do you think will happen in June 2022, Bruno?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult to sell austerity, especially in France. We've seen some weak attempts to gain some money in taxation of fuel, for example, and the country was on a standstill for months. So the pressure of the people to the government is that big. Even though the president is elected for 6 years and has more time to do something, I think it's still a very difficult political decision and almost suicide to implement it. But at the same time, a very big necessity to do so for the next generations as well.
Strong words and big decisions. Thank you so much to both of you, Anne Elisabeth Moutet and Bruno Vers-trae-te. Thank you both.